You begin with the belief that knowledge secures truth. You assume that what you understand is reliable simply because it feels coherent. This assumption is so embedded in your thinking that you rarely pause to verify its foundation. You trust the structure of your conclusions without examining the instrument that produces them. Al-Ghazali questioned this confidence early in his inquiry. He noticed that the feeling of certainty often precedes verification, as if the mind protects its own stability by resisting its own investigation. His observation challenges you to reconsider whether knowledge is illumination or merely the familiar arrangement of inherited assumptions. When you rely on what feels true without examining why it feels true, how do you distinguish insight from habit? Al-Ghazali lived in a world shaped by debate, analysis, and competing claims to truth. Baghdad's intellectual circles prided themselves on precision and argument. Theologians defended their doctrines, philosophers refined their logic, and mystics pursued inner certainty. Each group was convinced of its own clarity. Within this environment, Al-Ghazali recognized a shared pattern. Each thinker trusted the reliability of their reasoning without questioning the foundation that made such trust possible. If every framework claims certainty, how do you determine which certainty can withstand scrutiny? You assume that your senses, reasoning, and learning form a stable foundation. Yet Al-Ghazali realized that each of these sources can mislead. Senses are inconsistent, logic can be circular, and inherited teachings depend on the reliability of those who transmit them. When he tested each source, none proved capable of validating itself. You can sense the same instability when you notice how quickly clarity dissolves under sustained questioning. What appears obvious becomes uncertain when you ask how you know it. Al-Ghazali's crisis was not emotional collapse but intellectual honesty, the recognition that certainty built on untested tools cannot endure. If every path to truth depends on a tool that cannot verify itself, what secures the truth of any conclusion? You often assume that your understanding reflects the world directly. But if you examine your own thinking, you begin to notice how much of your certainty arises from internal processes rather than external verification. The mind organizes information according to coherence, repetition, and familiarity. These mechanisms generate the sense of clarity long before truth is established. Al-Ghazali observed that the mind does not reveal reality, it constructs interpretations that feel stable. When an idea fits neatly with what you already believe, you accept it without demanding evidence. When it disrupts your assumptions, you resist it even if it is valid. The mind favors order over accuracy, comfort over correction. This insight forces you to reconsider what it means to know. The feeling of knowing is not proof of truth. It is merely evidence that your internal system has reached temporary agreement with itself. In this sense, what you call knowledge may function as a veil, preventing the mind from recognizing its own limitations. If the mind can generate false clarity through its own structures, how do you identify which clarity corresponds to reality rather than to mental habit? Reason appears to be your most reliable tool. It analyzes, structures, and orders thought. Yet Al-Ghazali recognized a limitation. Reason can evaluate ideas, but it cannot transcend itself to validate the assumptions on which it depends. Every rational argument begins with premises, and reason cannot prove those premises without appealing to further assumptions. The process becomes circular. You can test this in your own experience. When you justify a belief, you rely on principles you rarely question. You assume the coherence of logic because the mind is built to operate through coherence. But this assumption does not guarantee correspondence with truth. It only guarantees internal consistency. Al-Ghazali concluded that reason is powerful within its domain but powerless to secure its own foundation. It functions like a well-crafted instrument that cannot explain its origin or ensure its unbiased operation. When reason attempts to justify itself, it only rearranges its own assumptions. If a tool cannot confirm its own reliability, how can it serve as the final measure of truth? When you trace your convictions, you often discover that many of them were acquired through repetition, not through verification. You believe certain things because they have been affirmed repeatedly by family, culture, or community. Over time, familiarity begins to resemble truth. Al-Ghazali observed that people rarely examine the foundations of their strongest beliefs precisely because those beliefs feel natural. The mind prefers stability, and stability often arises from what has been rehearsed rather than what has been investigated. Habit becomes a quiet architect of certainty. This raises a challenge. How do you distinguish truth from training? When you encounter an idea that contradicts your habitual worldview, your first response is usually discomfort rather than analysis. The mind reacts to unfamiliar reasoning as if it were error, even before evaluating it. Al-Ghazali warned that the comfort of habit can create a veil thicker than ignorance. Ignorance can be corrected through learning, but habitual belief hides itself behind the illusion of clarity. You stop questioning precisely at the point where questioning is most needed. If your deepest certainties are shaped by repetition, how do you know whether you believe something because it is true or because you have become accustomed to believing it? At this point, Al-Ghazali recognized that the issue was not merely false beliefs but the framework through which beliefs were evaluated. Before knowledge can be trusted, perception must be purified. This purification is not emotional or symbolic. It is intellectual and psychological. It involves identifying the biases, desires, and fears that shape interpretation. You begin to see that your conclusions are influenced by what you hope is true or by what you fear might be false. Desire pushes you towards certain interpretations. Fear pushes you away from others. These tendencies distort perception long before the reasoning process begins. Al-Ghazali taught that clarity arises only when these distortions are suspended. Purification means observing thought without the pressure to defend it, modify it, or protect its implications. It means allowing ideas to stand without forcing them into alignment with your preferences. When perception becomes neutral, understanding becomes possible. Truth does not require the mind to create it. It requires the mind to stop obscuring it. In this sense, purification is less about gaining knowledge and more about removing the filters that prevent knowledge from being recognized. If clarity emerges only when biases fall silent, what remains when the mind becomes transparent? As Al-Ghazali continued his inquiry, he realized that the most fundamental veil was not knowledge, reason, or habit, but the self that claims to know. The assumption that there is a stable, reliable knower at the center of thought is rarely questioned. Yet when examined, the self reveals itself as a shifting collection of tendencies, beliefs, emotions, and perceptions. You assume that your thoughts belong to a coherent self, but if you observe carefully, you notice that thought arises before you choose it, shifts without your consent, and disappears without your control. The knower seems less like a stable agent and more like an interpretive position claimed after the fact. Al-Ghazali's insight destabilizes the entire structure of knowing. If the self is not fixed, then knowledge that depends on the stability of the self cannot be fixed either. This does not lead to nihilism, it leads to deeper inquiry. The question shifts from what is true to who is the one claiming to know. When the self is examined and found uncertain, the authority of its knowledge dissolves. What remains is the possibility of understanding that does not belong to an egoic center. If the one who knows is unstable, what meaning remains in what it claims to know? Al-Ghazali discovered that after every layer of certainty was questioned, and after every method of knowing was examined, a different kind of clarity emerged. This clarity was not produced by argument or analysis. It was not the result of accumulating knowledge. It appeared only when the mind stopped asserting its authority and began to observe its own limitations. You can sense this shift when you stop trying to force understanding and instead allow thought to settle. In this quiet, reasoning continues to function, but it no longer pretends to be the source of truth. It becomes a tool rather than an identity. Insight arises when the self steps back from its impulse to possess truth. Al-Ghazali taught that certainty of this kind does not belong to the mind. It appears when the mind becomes receptive. Truth is not constructed. It is revealed when interference ceases. This is not passivity. It is the recognition that understanding emerges through alignment, not assertion. When the self loosens its grip, knowledge loses its role as a veil and becomes a signal pointing beyond itself. If truth is revealed only when the self is silent, what is the nature of the one who witnesses it? At the end of Al-Ghazali's inquiry, thought no longer claimed sovereignty. Reason kept its value, but not its dominance. Knowledge retained its usefulness, but not its authority. What remained was a quiet awareness that did not depend on certainty to recognize truth. You reach this same point when you stop demanding that your conclusions secure reality. In this stillness, truth does not appear as an object to be obtained but as a condition that emerges when the mind stops distorting it. Knowledge no longer functions as a veil, it becomes transparent. When knowing ends, what quietly reveals itself is not an answer but the clarity that needs no answer.